So, welcome everyone to this webinar on incentive plans, which we'll be having today in English. I think we're predominantly Dutch, but I'm recording this for later purposes, and that way more people can use it. Also, founders who are non-Dutch speaking but working in the Netherlands, or anyone from abroad. So, thanks for your patience, and at least we can do the little play together. You find me today not in my office, but in my guest bedroom, um, which happens sometimes when you have two daughters, and I had to pick one up at childcare. So today I'm doing a home webinar, which I think fits the topic because today it's incentive plans, and essentially what we talk about is how to build bigger tables, how to invite people into the ownership of the company. So let's dive in. By the way, any experiences or questions you may have, share them in chat because this is hardly a technical subject. Today we talk about stats in incentive plans. But before we dive in, let's first establish what is an incentive plan. There is no official term to it, so I've tried to construct one after a few years of experience. So I say an incentive plan, as far as I'm concerned, is a formalized scheme with a financial background used to attract and retain and encourage and reward people who contribute to the company, its culture, and its goals. Incentive plans, many things can be incentivizing. I have heard someone say a pat on the back can be equally, but today incentive plans, we try to make it a little bit more financial. We try to talk about topics that are about instruments that aren't so much in fixed wage, but let's say contingent additional pays, either in equity or bonus pay or whatever you want to do to encourage people to do what they do well. Why would you implement an incentive plan? The question is asked many a time, and that's also because in the olden days, one would say you got your job, you got your salary, and that should be enough. Well, it no longer is. We got a tight labor market, but also we're trying to do new things. And as tight as the labor market is, the capital market can be equally. So sometimes you got to find ways of making your money last, and an incentive plan can be a effective means to do so. So let's zoom in on why do you want to implement one? Why do you want to add a contingent plan to fixed wage with your company and employees? Well, first of all, it can help you control the burn rate. So if people are willing to take lower fixed pay in exchange for, well, a risk kicker at the end, should everything go well and then some, then you can control your burn rate, make your investment last much longer, do more research, and increase the chances of you finding a product readiness level or innovation state that you're content with. And at some point, you may be past that. So what I portray here also is kind of the product or even startup life cycle, finance life cycle. At some point, your product may be ready. You may be going to market, and that's when it's hard work. So you're profitable in year, but you still have a lot of investment to repay. So people are working hard, and they may not be remunerated yet at a similar level as they would be at a more established company. So you need to keep something on the horizon. And then at some point, you may become a stable market party yourself. And then you got to find ways of not becoming boring, just any other totally boring, any other company. You got to find ways of keeping people on board. And an incentive plan can be a good means to do so. So when I want to visualize this, I often think of going from a company where only the founders or management board has fun when things go well, but also needs to pay the bill at the end, to building a longer table and pulling up more chairs. And does that work? One might ask, does that work? Well, the stats are there. When you have a broad-based incentive plan, productivity rises 33% on average. These are not my own stats. These are stats that you can find in the amalgamated read in the Harvard Business Review. They have a big file on incentive plans. You can see that the companies become more productive, The employees who are involved, they earn more and better, and also the companies become less likely to lay off workers. Now, these are mainly US dominated stats, which is a common theme in the world of incentive plans. And that's because incentive plans are much more common when you look at companies in, let's call it startup culture, young companies, innovative companies, than they are in more established companies, whether they be mid-market or blue chip. And since the United States is a very dominant landscape in startup culture, you're going to see that a lot of best practices are going to be somewhat impacted by what works in the US. And sometimes this does not actually work that well in the Netherlands, but we'll get to that later. In the Netherlands, too, there's attention for it. Just last month, September 23rd, a letter to Parliament was published because through a motion, Parliament was asked to do some investigations into how can we get more employee participation going on in the Netherlands. It's conceived as a topic that may be good for a more equal distribution of equity and savings throughout society, and also, making sure that there's more people in on the cut when things go well. Turns out, the study shows that this works. It increases employee motivation, strengthens connections to the company, and it helps retain staff. And you often also see that the startups and scale-ups themselves are better off because they do indeed reduce burn rate and get to tap into a cohort in the labor market that without a variable element, they would not have been able to involve. So I say good news all around if implemented well. That's why many people would want to implement it. But funny thing is, I see this myself as a advisor to many a start and scale up business from a tax perspective. I see that the tax itself is not necessarily what gives people cold feet. So they may start and then back out. What I see is just the decision paralysis and a difficulty of obtaining good information makes it, difficult for people to get a start. And this was also one of the takeaways of this research that was performed on behalf of the Dutch government. The most important thing that stands in between companies and employees and an incentive plan is not their will to implement, but just the sheer vastness of choices they need to make and not knowing where to start. So with a little questionnaire, I wanted to see if I could kind of, break the ice on this topic. But first, I think we got to establish what incentive plans we talk about, because we got to make sure that we use one terminology, because otherwise all the statistics make no sense. So there are endless varieties of incentive plans. And in order to do any sort of questionnaire, you have to at one point make a decision on how to categorize them. I tend to do that in this one way. I say there are incentive plans, main category, and you can divide those into cash-based plans and equity-based plans. And the cash-based plans are usually implemented through, let's call it the stack of the employment agreement. So either they are a clause in the original employment agreement themselves, or more often they are a separate addendum to the employment agreement. And you have the equity-based plans, which are implemented through some sort of ownership agreement. Usually it will be a subscription agreement followed by, for instance, a shareholder agreement or a share certificate agreement, whatever needs to be done. If I then look into that branch of this tree, that's the cash-based plans, I see the KPI or individual bonus plan, and I see the virtual stock plan, stock appreciation right, or a company bonus plan, any type of bonus plan that's not necessarily linked to the individual's performance, but mainly linked to company-wide markers. And then if we look at equity-based plans, we look at, this is a little bit of a hybrid one, but I include there the ESOP, so the employee stock option plan, which gives employees a call option to equities in the company, which they can call when certain milestones are hit at a certain strike price. Then we have depository stock or share certificates, which I've come to find out is mainly a Dutch thing. In the United States, you will see a shareholder trust, But really what this is you become the owner of a derivative to a share, which gives you full economic ownership of the equity, but you do not actually get to be the stock owner, because when you have the stock, the share, you also have the meeting rights and the voting rights. And especially when you're in a VC cycle, you want to kind of keep the company decision-making process a little bit more compact. So this is a way to make sure that you do have all the financial exposures and benefits of share ownership, but you don't have the legal rights, but also obligations that go with it. So there can be a delta between the control table and the cap table. And of course, the full-blown thing is actually becoming a stock owner in the company, which means you get to go to the General Assembly of Shareholders, which means you get to vote, which means you actually get to have a seat at the table. So from a tax perspective, I have to put that in there. This is also pretty relevant because all the items that are implemented through the employment contract ultimately are, exposures to additional wage, which means that they are taxed when they pay out at wage tax rates, so 37 to 49.5%. Whereas the elements implemented as equity plans, they are separate from the employment agreement, at least absent any wording to link them in a shareholder agreement, and they follow the route of equity income. So in the Netherlands, in our boxes systematic, that means box 2 or 3, that means any proceeds you receive after obtaining the shares is taxable as equity income. So either pay as you earn, 24.5 to 31% in box 2, or a deemed return of 6.17% taxed at 36%, which is a very good deal of a very high-performing stock and a very poor deal for low-performing stock. Do note, before you can obtain the equities, there can be a wage tax event if you have a explicit or implied discount. So that's one of the reasons sometimes people kind of gravitate towards the elements that are implemented through the employment contract. It's simpler. All you need to do is add an addendum to the employment contract, sign it both. Usually you would not say no to a potential for additional pay. And if you want to do something with equities, there's going to be notary lawyers involved. There's going to be separate titles to ownership. So there's no organic link anymore. So that's where you're going to see that this may already be a reason for people to, or for companies at least, to prefer, the cash-based plans. So if we revisit that, employee incentive plans, you see how I keep the color coding aligned. Box 1, blue. Box 2 and 3, dark blue. Look, same thing here. Additional bonus pay, KPI bonus, or stock appreciation rights / virtual stock, equity-based plans, ESOP or certificates or shares. So let's zoom in on this, just so when we dive into the pie charts that you have a clear visual. Here's my visual for a KPI bonus. This is the dog sits, the dog gets a treat. Very individual, does not have to do necessarily with what the pack does. Very direct throttle feel. But yeah, it's easy to create tension between people with KPI bonuses because at some point they may interfere. So if you want to make sure that everybody just does, whatever may be best for the company, maybe you could choose for a they should say virtual stock bonus or stock appreciation right. So that's a team-based bonus. The team wins, everybody gets a cut. Next one, the ESOP. That's an employee stock option plan, which gives you an option to call stock. You're not yet the owner of a share, but when a certain milestone is hit, you can get it at a certain price, which means the higher up the value is at that moment, the more in the money your option is. So there's already, from the moment of you obtaining the option, there's already an incentive for you to do something to increase the company's equity value. Then we have the share certificates, which means you become the economic owner of the company, but you don't have the associated legal ownership rights. I call that now the trust, just for, in Dutch we say stock, but this is the shareholder trust that may be interposed, which gives you the equity rights. Visualize that as a long table. You get to join, and then the holy grail is actual company stock. You also get to hold the chess pieces, or whatever game they're playing in this instance. I'm not familiar with it, despite what you may think. Then putting that, in the image one more time, this is what we talk about when I ask about KPI bonus, stock appreciation rider, virtual stock, ESOP trust, and full company stock. So now let's see some stats. I have asked, so this is small batch. My N is only like 50, but I do think that the people who responded to my questionnaire make it very representative, at least for the Netherlands, because they are mostly business owners in the start and scale up scene, or they may be involved with policy, or they are advisors who work a lot with, well, implementing incentive plans. So I think that even though the number of respondents is limited, I think that it's a zip file to a much larger batch. So let's just say it's as representative as it's going to get if you want non-US data and if you want government data. So how did I do this? I made a jot form, asked people to fill it out, and they did. And here's where we go. So without further ado, the stats. First question I asked is, in general, which type of incentive plan do you think encourages achieving company goals best? And noteworthy here is that the cake is taken by the answer that is a mix of both. So almost 3/4 of the respondents think that if you have both a cash-based plan and an equity-based plan at the same time, you're going to achieve company goals best. And I think it makes sense, because sometimes if you implement only an equity-based plan, this gives fruit only when there's an exit event or a dividend event. And this can take a long time. And especially when you're in that period where you are running a profitable business, you've gone past the break-even point. So it's working hard, but you may not yet be in a position where you're able to declare dividends because you still have a lot of pre-investments to pay down. People could lose interest along the way if it takes too long. So if you then top it up with maybe an annual bonus, be it KPI or team bonus, this could be a very effective measure without, making people too interested in the short term only. So I guess the answer makes sense. But if somebody has experiences or different views, do let me know. Then the question is, what do you think is most investable? So what do you think investors like? There's this earbug where people in markets, they say that any VC before investing will want you to have in place or commit to at least 10% being owned by staff. So the question then becomes, when is staff an owner? Does the cap table include a bonus potential, or does the cap table only include people who own equity rights? So if we ask, what do you think is most investable? Maybe some people have this in their head as well. Maybe they think investors want people to have equity. Maybe they think investors want, to keep it compact and do only cash-based plans to make sure that if somebody leaves the company, chances are very large that they don't become dead equity because they're just no longer employed. So they're no longer part of the cash-based plan, of the salary-based plan. Well, you see here, it's all over the place. The answer is more difficult. However, the most often stated answer is a cash-based plan. People would think that it is most investable to implement a cash-based plan. And I think it makes sense because a cash-based plan never really has any formal voting or meeting rights. So maybe this also has to do with ease of decision-making. Interesting. Next one. Experience check. So for this question, I asked, which of the 5 have you been involved with, either as staff, beneficiary, or a founder? Which do you think is best? So green is, I have experience. Purple is, I think this is the best option for me. And dark blue is, this is the best option for company or investors. So what I read here is that a lot of people have experience with the KPI bonus plan. And I do think this makes sense because this is the base case bonus plan, right? We all know the KPI bonus plan from even when maybe one of your first jobs. I remember when I was in high school, I walked past the doors to get people to support a good cause. this was the good cause was called Veilig Verkeer Nederland, or Safe Traffic Netherlands. So ultimately, I was trying to get subscription money for additional speed bumps on roads. Was not that popular, but when I did sign somebody on, I did get a kicker myself. I think like 2 months or something vulgar like that, where my bonus for getting the new subscriber. That's a KPI bonus. There was no team bonus because I think the company was scared of a free rider effect, which, knowing me in high school, is a very real danger. So yeah, the KPI bonus is definitely most often seen. However, if we combine the amount of people who have said, I have been involved with either a share certificate plan or a full company stock, that does outnumber the people who have been involved with the KPI bonus plan. However, I tend to think this might not mean that they are more prevalent in the Netherlands in total. I think this may be skewed statistics because of the nature of my respondents. Many of them are founders. So yeah, over here, a little bit over the place as well. I do see that what people think is the best for beneficiaries, I found this one noteworthy, is the virtual stock or company bonus plan. So call it a stock appreciation right, if you will. That means a bonus plan that is not linked. So pure bonus wage plan, not linked to owning any equities. You don't need to have a downside risk to obtain equities in the companies, but your bonus potential is linked to how the team performs over how you perform as an individual. I like this as well. We actually have this at our company as well. We have a mixed plan, but this is one of the two legs. And the idea, for me at least, is if people share in how the company performs, point one, they have a incentive to be as useful as possible rather than work in islands. What I mean by that is, just imagine at the end of the year, people would have a KPI plan where they get a bonus linked to whatever client they bring into the company. Then maybe if on December 30th, our largest client calls, but my colleague's personal client calls as well, and they both need urgent help, a KPI bonus may give them an incentive to prioritize their personal client, whereas a team bonus may give them incentive to prioritize the company's most important client. And also, people are afraid sometimes of a free rider effect, which means that also people, when you have a team-based bonus, sometimes people who hardly contribute to the team may also be in on the bonus. That could be a bad thing because it can be demotivating for the people who work really well. At the same time, it could also be a reason to, to say something, to speak up, to not wait for the boss to step in, which is always a one-sided conversation, or at least shouldn't be, but it often is. And sometimes it's much more effective when colleagues kind of spark each other and they say, hey, you're kind of slacking. How about, we start putting our backs in. So found this an interesting one. I also see that it was thought to be best for company and investors most often as well. So interesting one there. The Netherlands stock appreciation right lands, perhaps. So yeah, here they are on a one-by-one basis. Which one do you have experience with? Well, most commonly seen one, KPI bonus, but combined, a form of equity is over 50% of the respondents. So make of that what you will. Happy to see any data analytics going on in chat, should there be any. Which do you think is best for staff? Funny thing we see here is that there's more people happy for staff with salary-based plans than with equity-based plans. And for investors, same thing, actually. So perhaps one of the reasons for that is the Dutch unique and weird tax systematics, where you pay personal income tax on a deemed return on the value of your equity stakes. So sometimes you may have years on end where you are paying tax on a deemed return of 6%, which may even, the basis on which is calculated may even increase as the company value increases, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting any money from the equity. So there can be a mismatch between tax and cash there. And maybe that's one of the reasons people would think it's not as attractive, even though in the longer term, it may be a bargain if you have a high performing equity stake. Because just imagine you have an exit and it turns out your internal rate of return exceeded 15% every year, or 18%. That's 3 times 6. that ultimately means that your effective tax rate will be a third of 36%, 12%. You're not going to get that anywhere. But in the meantime, you may have been paying tax for income you never received, and you got to keep your eyes on the target. So I sometimes wonder, what role does tax play in this answer? Why is a cash-based plan better for staff, even though it is the highest tax one and doesn't result in any ownership? There you are. Quintus, good point. It might even be so that the company goes bankrupt and then you have paid taxes over the years and you still have no return. So you're a big fan of a trust structure. Get it? I get it. Okay. Next question. What percentage? So this is sometimes a good one as well, because whenever I help implement an incentive plan, I'm going to get the question, what percentage do you think we should allocate to, call it the ESOP, call it the trust? And I say, that's a matter of personal preference. I always say 10% is what VC expects. There is evidence that the broader your spread, the more effective your plan. But, you got to be bold. So I asked, what percentage should companies target staff to be on the cap table for come the exit? And I see that up to 5% is the most often given answer, and then over 20% comes in second. I think I may have misworded the question, because maybe a lot of the respondents think that I mean any individual staff member. And of course, then it's a lot to ask to give all of them 10 to 20%. I wonder if that played a role in these statistics, or maybe the respondents just think a little drizzle is just fine. Wonder what you guys make of this. I've always learned that at least 10% is a good way to go. And I guess if we combine all the figures that are over 5%, it's a lot more than the single figure that goes up to 5%. So I guess this one remains kind of an open point. I would say take 10 and up as a good number. Next question is then, how much should the founding or management team be on the cap table for by then? So sometimes you will see very diluted founding teams, which doesn't need to be a bad thing. Think of very large companies other than, I guess, Tesla or something in the Elon Musk portfolio, and think of how much the original founders still own. It doesn't have to be a bad thing to own a minute percentage of a huge company. Come and exit. So before you go public, how much should the managing team be on the cap table for? People could answer either always a majority, which would make sense if you think about the decision-making process, or somewhere between 1 and 2 quarters, or doesn't really matter as long as they retain control, which is actually something you can do through a shareholder trust, or through changing the statutes to make sure that you have some sort of a golden share or a veto right. There's ways to still have over 50% of the voting rights, even though you don't own over 50% of the equities. Turns out most people answered somewhere between 25 and 50%. It's okay to drop below half once you get to a public phase. Good to know. That also shows you how much room you have left for investors and staff. Then, if we do consider implementing a plan that comes with equity, then since equity comes with, ownership, you usually would want some sort of skin in the game. So that's the question. Do you think that a financial downside risk, like an upfront investment or a buy-in loan, skin in the game, potential for losing money, makes an employee incentive plan more efficient? Clear answer, 75% of the respondents said yes. So what this means is, if you want somebody to have a cut in company profits, do you also want them to bleed if the company does as well? Reasons not to go for that is sometimes because it may not seem fair. You may want to keep the broader employee base away from the decision-making process just because it's going to be inefficient. And so if they can't really influence directly company decisions, doesn't always seem fair that they should bleed. At the same time, when things look up, if an incentive plan only has an upside potential, yeah, I guess it's going to be very easy to jump ship if you hit a rough patch as a company. And that means it only is going to achieve one of its few goals. Then the question is it best for an incentive plan to be inevitable or optional? And what I mean by this is you could give people a choice. So just imagine you implement a share plan or a stock appreciation right, and you tell people you have a bonus and you can either choose to have it in cash or you can allocate it and reinvest in the company. So either keep some more money in the stock appreciation right or obtain shares in the company. Or do you want it to be a mandatory thing? Do you think the plan is most efficient when you say there's no ways around it? With a certain promotion to a certain level comes the obligation to buy some stock, because we only want people in decision-making echelons of the company that also have a direct throttle fuel also when a decision takes a bad turn. Looks like 2/3 of the respondents thinks it is best for an incentive plan to work on an opt-in basis over an inevitable one or a mandatory one. So this is something also to think about when you implement an incentive plan. Does not have to be for everyone. It might be something that people buy into. And, it also kind of gives people a opportunity to decide on their own wants and needs and risks. And this is something I think when you design an incentive plan is a good takeaway either way. Because funny thing I see is when you design an incentive plan, it is usually company management that wants to do something good and also incentivizing for company staff. However, company staff usually is not asked for any input. So management thinks, I'm not sure they're going to like this. I don't think they want this, but they hardly ever really just ask, them. So maybe a plan that's on an opt-in basis also gives people the opportunity to make their own decisions. Maybe somebody is in rush hour of life and really just wants fast cash over a long-term stake, even if the latter in the long run could be much more lucrative just because they need the money now and not later. I don't know. Or maybe they're very risk averse or very risk savvy. Interesting one. Next one. Should people get to keep units after vesting? The vested units are there. Somebody leaves the company. Should they be able to keep their units? Some companies they have very, matters of principle about this. Some people think that if a person leaves your company, but they're still on the cap table somehow, they could become an ambassador because it's still interesting for them to see you do well. So this may be a reason for them to, bring in a new client for you. I believe McKinsey is famous for it. They have a lot of business. It's only hearsay on my end, by the way, from alumni. Doesn't necessarily have to do with an incentive plan, by the way, but you could create a model like that. At the same time, when people still have a cut and they're no longer actively contributing to the company, or at least not on a day-to-day basis, they could become what's called dead equity. And that does kind of reduce the throttle fuel for the people still left behind. So you can just imagine if there's a lot of former employees sharing in the exit, working hard to make that exit happen is going to be less enticing. Okay, what do we see here? Keep units after vesting, very slim margin, 53% no, 47% yes. However, we've seen that 53% of the vote can sometimes be enough to take the whole presidency. So, next one. Marta, good question. Could it also work the other way if it creates conflicts of interest, don't you think? Yes, could also work the other way. So you would vote vested units, give them back. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, maybe you talk about if you move on to a different profession, go into politics. Then the question is, just imagine you would want a downside risk. How much is fair? Pretty spread across the board. Most people think 3 to 6 months wages is a fair downside risk if you're going to give people some sort of ownership in the company in whichever way. Guess it makes sense. It does seem like a lot. Not sure if we're talking 3 to 6 gross or net, but yeah, 3 to 6 months wages is a effective downside risk, so to say, uh, according to our respondents. I would imagine, logically speaking, the further up the chain of command you go, the larger the commitment may be that you ask. But yeah, this makes sense. Then the question also is, how big should the upside potential be? Because just imagine you're working for a scale-up business and you're kind of deferring your fixed wage in exchange for some sort of a banger at the end. What should we be talking about to really make this worth your while? Well, people say it should be at least an annual salary when it happens. So let's call this a stock appreciation, right? Company exits, you're an early joiner, you should get at once at least an annual salary to compensate for your risk and your efforts, and also to see this up front to make it interesting. So next item was a life-changing event. I think in many ways getting two annual salaries in 1 year is a life-changing event, but I think you know what the background of the question is. Next one. Which of the following vesting schemes do you think work best? So vesting schemes, just a little context, I think most people know, but just to make sure, vesting scheme means here's your 10 shares, but they're not toggled on yet. So they don't really have any exit rights or dividend rights until a certain time passes. So you may say after year 1, you own 25%. After year 2, you own 50. So they're like in a holding cell. And we open the door when you stay on board. I ask, what's the best vesting scheme? Do we think no vesting and immediate full ownership? Do we say no cliff, 4-year reverse vesting, so with 4-year increments, no cliff or 4-year incremental vesting? The difference between the two being with reverse vesting, you get full ownership up front, but you have to give them back to the company for, well, usually value 0 if you leave before the 4-year term. And incremental vesting mean they are still worth 0 when you get them and you accumulate the value. So yeah, that's a little nuance there that I hope is somewhat visible. Or should it be the 1-year cliff with 4-year incremental vesting and accelerated vesting at exit? That one takes the cake. I also think it is most commonly seen. So the 1-year cliff means in year 1, you may own the units, but none of them are toggled on yet. And after year 1, which is kind of like the tester, in 4 years, the vesting happens incrementally. Accelerated vesting means if you have unvested units, usually if you sell them, you can't exercise them for fair market value. This is if a exit takes place before your 4-year vesting vesting term has finished, you still get to tag along for full exit value, which really makes the vesting scheme something that pertains mostly to the lever clause. Then another question, because there's often time constraints, budget constraints. So people need to consider what is most important when I implement a incentive plan. So let's say there's 3 clauses. There's the subscription clause, which deals with how many units do you get, how much do they cost, and how do you pay for them. Then there's the vesting clause, which means how do the units that you own get toggled on over time. And then there's the lever clause, which says what you have to do with your units when you leave under different circumstances. So good lever, bad lever, maybe intermediate lever. And turns out the most important one apparently is the lever clause, because people are happiest with a incentive plan that would have an off-the-shelf subscription clause and an off-the-shelf vesting clause, but then put all their time and effort, if they had constraints, into the lever clause. The least important one turns out to be the vesting clause. Guess it makes sense, because vesting is really just there to make sure that people still stay on board once the incentive has been granted. But still, even after it's been granted, doesn't mean it really does anything just yet. And then final one, which I think is very good for me, toilet duck man, is if the two were conflicting and in a perfect trade-off, what do you think is most important? The simplicity of your plan or the efficiency? And simplicity, I mean, how easy is it to administer, to keep track? And efficiency means what's going to be the effective tax rate, for instance. Turns out efficiency is more important than simplicity. And where could these trade off? Well, for instance, with a hurdle share. Just imagine you want to give somebody equity in the company, because you think it's going to be a high growth profile, and the ultimate tax rate is pretty friendly in high growth equity situations, but the shares are valuable. So the package day, what you want to give them, is maybe a little bit too expensive for them to afford. So you make the shares lighter, you make them worth less, you make them dispreferent, you give them a hurdle. That's going to be pretty difficult because it makes a new share class. You may need to get a ruling on the valuation. You may need to look at, is this a lucrative stake? So this adds a lot of admin to make sure that the employee can buy the stake you want him to have and has access to that high-performing, lucrative regime that you envisage for them. But it does make the plan more efficient. Should you do it? Apparently, 6 times out of 10, the answer is yeah, probably a good idea, because the plan's efficiency is more important than simplicity. And I guess this makes sense because simplicity is mostly important for the company, whereas efficiency, I guess, is very important for the beneficiary. So yeah, however higher the net gains are, the more efficient the plan is. That for me concludes my insights. If you have any questions, do toss them in, or feel free to connect with me. You probably already are, because I think most of you got here through LinkedIn, or I already knew you, for instance, because you're my brother. Thanks so much for watching. Big honor. Otherwise, I say thank you very much. Hope this alleviates some decision paralysis. I know this was a lot, but thanks for checking in, and hope to see you in the next webinar.